Jaws is a horror thriller that came out in 1975 and is directed by Steven Spielberg. This is one of those movies that keeps getting referenced ad nauseum because of its reputation as the horror movie that made people not want to go into the ocean. With that being said, shocker, it's also a masterpiece of horror and suspense. This is one of those movies like The Godfather where trying to find a unique angle on this film was difficult because it's been analyzed to death. It's a perfect movie, and everyone knows it's a perfect movie. The filmmaking is masterful, the performances are incredible, the premise, while simple, is strong. A shark infests the waters, so now 3 men are off to kill the shark before it kills more people. Simple premise, but the film is elevated by its execution. It's truly remarkable how a film from 1975 remains just as entertaining, suspenseful, and impressively filmed as it did when it released. I know it's been said God knows how many times, but it is truly one of the greatest films of all time. In order to understand why this movie is so good, it's necessary to talk about the behind the scenes. Long story short, it was a production disaster. The filming occurred from May through October 1974, and it almost didn't make it onto the screen. The mechanical sharks were tested in fresh water initially, and they worked perfectly fine in those conditions, but they malfunctioned very frequently because the salt in the ocean corroded the mechanics of the sharks. It stretched the shoot from a standard 50-day shoot into an agonizing 159-day shoot, because Spielberg insisted on filming in the ocean and using real boats, which led to several issues like the camera boat sinking on the first day and the prop boat, formerly known as the Orca, starting to sink while the actors were on board. Not only that, but the ocean currents led to the boats being out of position and out of frame, forcing the camera crew to constantly re-anchor and wait for the lighting and the sun to align again. It also led to unpredictable swells, leading to steady camera shots being damn near impossible. The cast and crew were also constantly dealing with severe seasickness, sunburns, and exhaustion, making the shoot incredibly slow. Not only that, but the relentless delays and accidents that were occurring on set led to the budget to grow from $4 million to a staggering $9 million. It's also worth noting that the script was being written and rewritten while the movie was in production. Spielberg admitted that he enjoyed the last 110 pages of Peter Benchley's novel of the same name, but that he also disliked the characters, finding them hard-nosed and cynical, and instead rooting for the shark. He found the first couple of drafts written by the author Peter Benchley to be bloated, tonally distracting, and full of the unlikable characters found in his novel. He told Benchley that he wanted to remove subplots like the mob tie-in and an affair between Ellen Brody, Chief Brody's wife, and Matt Hooper, choosing instead to focus on a tense survival adventure with the characters being more sympathetic and heroic. The ending was their most famous disagreement. Benchley wanted to end the movie like his book, where the shark simply tires itself out and dies of exhaustion. Spielberg felt that was a letdown for a cinematic climax and opted for a triumphant, high-stakes ending where Chief Brody blows the shark up by shooting a compressed air tank in its mouth. There was also a feud between Richard Dreyfuss and Robert Shaw on set where they both clashed multiple times. There were plenty of times during the shoot when Robert Shaw was drunk on set, and some scenes with him were completely unusable because he kept slurring his words or forgetting his lines. However, something important to note is that Robert Shaw's monologue wasn't in the script at all. He improvised it and delivered it while he was drunk. Spielberg was sure that this would be the film to end his career and not allow him to work in the industry anymore because no one had ever worked on a film 100 days over schedule. That being said, all of these choices, all of these mistakes, and all of these delays led to a final product that remains not only as one of the greatest monster movies ever made, but also one of the most influential films ever made. As for the filmmaking itself, it's masterfully executed. There are so many shots that are underwater, and the reason why they take place underwater is because the mechanical sharks kept malfunctioning. So instead of showing the shark, Spielberg decided to shoot from the perspective of the shark, which adds a lot of tension since the mind conjures up more disturbing images than what were shown. The ambiguity is what adds tension, and when the shark is shown, it's in brief glimpses. Not only that, but like many people have mentioned, the score by John Williams is not only incredible in its composition, but it also adds a lot to the suspense. At the beginning of the score, the instrumentation is very soft, but as the song continues, we hear it getting louder as more instruments come in. We hear a foghorn, which is meant to be a signal that something's about to happen. with brief but also loud keys being played, until eventually there's a release of something louder and louder. What I also love about the soundtrack is that there's also this deceptively exciting and cheerful segment where it turns into something hopeful, and then it transitions back to disturbing instrumentation. It's there to add a false sense of security for the audience so that they think these characters are safe when really they're anything but. The cinematography in general, not just when it's underwater, but throughout the film, is masterful. There's so many one takes that go on for minutes and they're expertly crafted. There's also scenes where Chief Brody is at the beach, and whenever he's looking out into the ocean, there's shots of people with no one around them in the ocean from a distance. It's meant to put us in Brody's point of view and add to the paranoia because we already know there's a shark in the ocean, but no one else knows, and when we see these shots of people alone in the ocean from a distance, it's meant to add suspense and almost a barrier. Like there's a distance between what Chief Brody knows and what these townspeople know, and that's what adds suspense. There's also the dolly zoom, which looks flashy, but it's supposed to represent a reinforcement in Brody's paranoia. Which can be proven by the fact that beforehand, Brody's informed about a shark that ate a college girl, and since we're following his perspective, we know what he knows. Something I forgot to mention about the title track was that I really like how as the track gets louder and louder and as more instruments come in, the shark gets closer and closer to its victims. It really adds to the psychological unease and horror because in the back of the viewer's mind, they know that a shark is close. The pacing is another thing I loved about the filmmaking. The beginning does an excellent job of setting the audience for what's to come, but not giving too much. It's more so to set the tone than it is for excitement, and then the film takes its time, not to bore you with science or whatever, but to establish and develop these characters, which I'll get to in a little bit. The setting is also very unique for a horror thriller. A beach full of people enjoying their summer would not be the first place you'd normally think of for a horror thriller. Many people think of the darkest looking places like a haunted house or hospital or abandoned places, sewers, but what makes a beach during the summer full of happy people unique for a setting is that it's bright, full of happiness and nostalgia, and seems genuinely nice. Which adds a lot to the horror because it looks deceptively normal and inviting, but it's actually dangerous because it's infested with a shark. The tone is something I also need to talk about. People walk into this movie expecting a fun summer blockbuster, but the first half of the film is genuinely unsettling and disturbing. The kills, while off-screen or heavily shadowed for the most part, are still brutal. However, throughout the film there's also a sense of humor to add levity to the intensity and suspense, and an emotional core so that it's not one note. By the second half, it still has elements of a disturbing horror film, but it transitions to an exciting action flick more than a horror movie. All in all, the filmmaking is masterfully executed, and it's part of the reason why the film has not only excited people for so long, but also continues scaring them. Like I said before, Spielberg didn't like any of the characters in the novel and found them all unlikable, so he rewrote them into being more sympathetic and heroic. The characters were also brilliant vehicles for tension. Throughout the film, we mainly follow Brody's point of view, and the reason why the tension remains so strong throughout the film is not only because of the brilliant filmmaking, but also because the film spends a large part of its runtime developing and fleshing him out alongside Quentin Hooper. Essentially, we spend most of the runtime with his characters, so we want to see him achieve his goal of taking out the shark, which makes the moments of peril in this film all the more intense because we've grown to like him. And not only that, but I would argue that another driver of the tension is the back and forth between Hooper and Quint. Knowing that Robert Shaw and Richard Dreyfuss supposedly bantered behind the scenes added to the rivalry between these two characters and makes their scenes all the more genuine in how much distaste they have for each other. Quint is the experienced shark hunter who's tough and willing to take chances, while Hooper is a rich, educated college graduate who knows and studies sharks and is more precise and practical about his approach of getting rid of the shark. However, Chief Brody is not just the character we follow throughout the film, he's also a psychological case study. As the film progresses, he gets more and more anxious about the shark. At first, he's anxious about the beach because he knows there's a shark amidst the ocean, and then when he sees a little boy being eaten by the shark, his anxiety grows and he then experiences guilt because he let a little boy die, especially because he's a father of 2 boys. Then, when the beach is open again, this time on the 4th of July, he still goes to the beach with his family, but this time with extra protection. He lets his oldest son swim, but not in the area with the potential shark. He tells him to swim in another area, and that area is coincidentally where the shark goes and attacks some random guy and his son. How he reacts is interesting because instead of being filled with hatred for the shark, he's scared. He's scared of facing it off, but knows it's what he has to do to deal with this problem, and he's not experienced with shark hunting, so he's all the more scared of going through with it. Anyway, he goes with Quint and Hooper to kill this shark, and his anxiety grows because of the growing vulnerability to being attacked by the shark, and when the boat starts sinking, he calls for help. Quint destroys the phone, and that's Brody's breaking point. At this point, he's not just scared, but furious, which coincidentally, he uses all the anger and fear that was being built up throughout the film and unleashes it on the shark and shoots at it. He successfully kills the shark, and him and Hooper retrieve back to shore, and that's the end of the film. One thing I forgot to mention was that what makes the back and forth between Quint and Hooper add to the suspense is that you don't know what's going to happen between these two. Not only that, but since they're in the middle of the ocean, it's all the more intense if something does happen between these two. Like I mentioned before, Robert Shaw was also an alcoholic behind the scenes, which adds context to Quint's alcoholism. That's another detail that adds tension and suspense because you don't know where his alcoholism could be heading towards. One last detail, the transition of environments also adds to the suspense and growing isolation. These characters started out on land with lifeguards and whatnot, so there's always protection present despite their growing unease and anxiety. And then in the second act, these characters have to fight off the shark on a boat that's old and has seen better days, mirroring Quint because it's his boat, landing these characters in the ocean, isolated from land and from civilization. All of that is supposed to mirror the characters' not only growing anxiety and growing isolation, but also their growing vulnerability to the shark because now they have to face off the shark in a boat that's falling apart. All in all, the characters add a lot to the suspense, not only because over the course of the film we've grown to like them, but also because of their character traits that add to an unsettling atmosphere. Thematically, the film has a lot of unique angles. For example, there's an argument to be made that the villain of the film isn't the shark, rather it's the mayor for allowing the beaches to still be open even after knowing there's a shark. I will say, the thematic section of this video will echo a lot of what I already said, so take that for what you will, but anyway. The film handles ongoing isolation really well by having these characters be more disconnected as the film goes on. Because at first, they're on land trying to decide what to do with the shark with people around to help them, and then in the second half, these characters are in a boat that's falling apart in the middle of the ocean trying to handle the shark all by themselves. The film examines the psychology of anxiety through Brody because at first he's anxious about the shark on the beach, but as the film progresses he gets more anxious as authority figures like the mayor do less and less about it. And then when he's in the ocean, it's supposed to not only represent the isolation that these characters are feeling, but also the growing vulnerability to the shark until when their boat starts sinking, he calls for help. Quint smashes up the phone, and that's Brody's breaking point. He's still anxious, but now he lets out all the frustrations and all the anxiety that's been building up throughout the entire film. Not only that, but the ending where he's able to face off against the shark is supposed to not only represent the courage that's been building up as well, but also his frustration and anxiety being released onto the shark. It's not as thematically loaded as the other films I've discussed, but it still has some unique angles. For example, there's an argument to be made that the shark isn't really a villain in the sense that from our perspective we're rooting for Brody, Quint, and Hooper, but what about from the shark's perspective? There's an argument to be made that the shark was protecting itself more than it was attacking people since sharks live in the ocean. It also puts humans in a unique position because we typically associate humans as the dominant species, but in this scenario, the shark puts humans in a vulnerable position. Another theme that can be found in Jaws would be the fear of the unknown. Notice that most of the horror and suspense lies in what we don't see. For the first hour, we don't see the shark attacking or eating people. We just watch it from its perspective in some shots. Not to mention, when the crew go out to sea, they're heading into unfamiliar territories and into the shark's natural habitat. There's a certain amount of human arrogance at play with the crew thinking they can outsmart a shark in its natural habitat, and when the shark brutally eats Quint, it shows the crew that they got more than what they bargained for. This might be a stretch, but the context could have also had a play in the film's themes. The film was made during the Watergate scandal, which was most likely what pushed the distrust and authority angle of the film. For example, during the Watergate break-in, the Nixon administration tried to cover it up by hiding any incriminating evidence. In Jaws, the mayor, who's a stand-in for Nixon and his administration, tries to hide any evidence of the shark attacks on the beaches by telling Chief Brody and his statesmen to suppress the truth. Not only that, but mirroring the harassment faced by the press during Watergate, the reporters are kept at an arm's length and spun to protect the narrative that the mayor's pushing, that the beaches are safe and inviting. It's only until there's a shark attack laid out in the open for the public to see that the mayor seems defeated. The audience's satisfaction to seeing the mayor's lies catch up to him mirrors the American public's satisfaction with seeing Nixon resign after being exposed for Watergate. While it could be argued that calling this film a political allegory for the Watergate scandal is definitely a stretch, the timing and when the film was released are way too convenient for there to not be parallels. Despite the production disaster that it was, the film was a huge success, being the highest grossing film of 1975 and being one of the highest grossing films ever made when adjusted to inflation. It literally invented the summer blockbuster that we would all grow to be accustomed to. However, this film also inspired waves of shitty sequels, blockbusters, and exploitation films. Whether it be Jaws: The Revenge, The Meg, or Shark Exorcist, it truly left a footprint on the film industry. The thing is though, all of these crappy attempts at matching the greatness of Jaws only serve to prove how Jaws could have gone horribly wrong. What the Jaws sequels and all these shitty blockbusters get wrong about the original Jaws is that they make the shark the superstar rather than the characters. They're not able to capture the suspense and excitement of the original Jaws because they spend no time developing any of these characters. Now, there's way more issues with these shitty exploitation films that try to bank off the likeness of the original Jaws, and they don't all have to do with the filmmaking. What I tend to notice about these cheap knockoffs is that they all seem concerned with showing off their hot, quote-unquote, actresses rather than actually trying to deliver a suspenseful, horrifying, or exciting film. Not only that, but because these films are so cheap, they also have atrocious CGI for the shark, which just makes me appreciate Steven Spielberg's choice of not showing the shark that often in the original film. It's also one of the most referenced films ever made. Who hasn't heard the iconic theme by John Williams, or the iconic quote, "You're gonna need a bigger boat," or even heard of the finale with, "Smile, you son of a..." This is one of the most important films in film history, and it's one of the most iconic and memorable films ever made. This was the film to put Spielberg's name on the map, and it actually had a real-world impact. Apparently, after the success of the film, it led to widespread fear of sharks on beaches, which led to widespread shark slaughter around the world. Steven Spielberg and the author of the original novel, Peter Benchley, both regretted how the film and the book depicted sharks that not only led to widespread frenzy, but also decimation of shark populations. But it wasn't all doom and gloom, because Benchley spent the rest of his life as a passionate ocean conservationist and dedicated much of his later life to shark protection. He stated that knowing what he knew about marine biology later in life, he could never write the book in good conscience ever again. In fact, he clarified that sharks do not actively target human beings, let alone hold grudges like the one in the story. Not only that, but on to more good news, the film was so impactful that it inspired generations of marine biologists to specialize in sharks. After 5 decades of research, we now know more about sharks than ever before. So I think it's safe to say its impact on film history is huge, its impact on pop culture is no small feat, but its real-world impact is enormous. In conclusion, Jaws is widely considered one of the most important films ever made. Not just for its expert filmmaking, troubled production, well-written and fleshed out characters, themes, or its influence, but because of all of these elements. It is honestly no wonder why this film is held in high regard, because there will truly never be a film like Jaws ever again. Because movies like Jaws have little to no flaws because they're perfect, and it'll continue being an influence to generations in years to come.